Hi and welcome back. In this section, we're going to be looking at APIs and REST interfaces. Now, you may have heard about APIs and REST interfaces before, and oftentimes they are quite confusing terms because sometimes people don't understand really what they are, or they don't fully grasp the simplicity of what an API and a REST interface is. Now, an API and a REST interface are not the same thing. However, nowadays, most APIs follow REST interface structures, especially web-based APIs. So we're going to look at what these things are exactly in a very quick video. But first, before we begin, imagine that you've got two applications. You've got a mobile application and a desktop app. And now both applications do the same thing, but one of them does it in a mobile and one of them does it in a desktop. And both of them get data from the same database. So what do you do? How do you structure your applications? Because both of them are using the same server, the same database. So one of the obvious options is to have duplicate code. Have the code to access the database duplicated. You've got the code written in your mobile app, and then you've also got it written in your desktop app. This is obviously not ideal because you've got to write the code twice, but it has one more drawback, which is that if you change the database, then you need to change the code in both places. So not only do you have to write the code twice, but whenever you make a change, you've also got to go and change both applications and ask your users to re-download them and all that. So not a very good solution. The better solution would be to create an API. And this stands for Application Program Interface. And that last word is really the key word. It is an interface. So it allows something to interface with something else through a simple structure, simple way. So what you would do is create a service that allows both applications to interact with the database without having to do that themselves. So what you would expect is your mobile app to send some data to this API, and then the API would put the data in the database. Or your desktop app could request some data to the API, and the API would get the data from the database and send it back. So this is essentially an interface between your applications and your database. So the applications only have to send data or request data and not worry about the database itself. So they would not be interacting with the database itself. Let's look at an example API. Let's say you've got this API living on this website, www.mysite.com/API. And now your applications are going to interact with this API, this website, requesting or sending data, and then the API is going to do the interaction with the database. One example of a request for data, you would ask the API to get something from the database, is just that, get, and then the API address. So let's have a look at this. The first word in pink here is get, and that tells your API that the application is expecting the API to send back some data, which the application can then use. The next part is the address of the API, in this case, www.mysite.com/API, and then you've got what's called the API endpoint, which is what exactly are we accessing in this API. And we can see that we're accessing users / and then a complicated number. And that number would be the user ID in this case. So this would be a unique identifier for your user. So therefore, we can read from here that the application wants to get some data related to a specific user with that ID. It's accessing the user's collection, and from that user's collection, it's accessing that specific ID. You would obviously have to program your API to do this, to accept this endpoint. Another example would be a POST request. In this POST request, we've got www.mysite.com/API, and then the endpoint is /users/new. If we access this endpoint with a POST as opposed to a GET, we're telling the API that we want to add some data to the database. And then we would also have to send it what data do we want to add. So in this case, we'd be adding the ID and the name of the user. The API would then worry about interacting with the database and putting that into the database. The application would only know that that was successful or unsuccessful. But obviously, not only get and post are the HTTP commands that we can use. HTTP is simply the protocol, the way that internet applications interact with one another. In a web-based API such as that one, we would need to tell it what do we want the API to do, as well as the URL or the address of the API. So we've seen get. When we send the API a request using the get keyword, we're asking it to retrieve something. We can use post, which we've seen, and that is used to tell the API to create something. But we can also use put, which is used to modify something. For example, to update a record on a table. You could change the user name, for example. And we've also got delete, which evidently deletes something from the database. So instead of get a specific user, you could send a delete a specific user request, and that would ask the API to interact with the database in a way that would delete the user. Remember, however, the applications don't know what that interaction entails. The application doesn't know what database is being interacted with, so they don't know if it's MongoDB or MySQL or any other type of database, for example. Okay, so what is REST? We've actually just looked at what REST is as well. REST is simply a way to structure these APIs, and that API that we saw a moment ago, that example API, was structured in a REST way. One of the key features of REST is that it is stateless. And what this means is that one API request does not affect the next. Evidently, if you delete a user, you wouldn't be able to get it the next time, but what this means is you can't chain requests in REST. Each request is independent, and it does something. So if you ask to delete a user, that user will be deleted. If you ask to get a user, you will get the user back, but it won't affect the way that the API works. Another key feature is resource-based. An API using REST is structured on a per-resource basis. For example, you've got your students, or your users, or your blog posts, or anything else. And this is very similar to objects in object-oriented programming. So you would have your /users/ID, for example, and you would get the ID, the user with that specific ID. Similarly, you could do the same with blog posts, or with furnitures, or with web page contents. So everything is resource-based, so that way it's very easy to understand exactly what's going on. So we've looked at what REST and what APIs are, but really this is quite an abstract concept, and the best way to understand it is by going in and creating our own API. So let's do that. I'll see you in the very next video.